we go. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Housing Justice webinar. Today's webinar is specifically focused on our new legislation with Assemblymember Gibson as our champion. AB 1199 is the bill number. This is Homes for Families, the corporate transparency and corporate landlord tax bill. We have a few panelists with us today, experts whose research this bill is reliant on. We're grateful for you all joining us. I just want to give participants a couple of more minutes to join us before I introduce the bill and pivot to our MVPs. Welcome again, everyone. I see more folks have joined us. I'm Jyotsru Bawa. I'm the Organizing and Campaigns Director at CRC. I'll be giving just an overview of the Homes for Families bill before we dive into the research that's supporting this bill. As more participants join us, I'll just take some time to maybe do some Zoom keeping. You'll notice we're using Zoom in its webinar function, which means that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar, bottom of the screen. If you could please, as we go along, type in your questions there. The participants, our presenters can see the questions there and take them as they come. The format that we've chosen for today is, I'll present a little bit about the bill and then pivot to Sage for their research and then move to the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project for their research. And then we'll have an opportunity for participants to ask questions to either presenter or to the CRC team. So just so you don't lose track of your questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. My colleagues, Brian Maxey, our communications manager, and Patty Villasenor, our organizer in Los Angeles, they're moderating our chat. So you'll see that there's some terminology, glossary support that'll be in the chat. We'll also put some helpful links in the chat. If you are on social media and you're moved to share something interesting that you hear, we encourage you to do that. Great. I think we'll wait for just another minute and then get started. All right, it's 12:04 and we'll officially begin. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Jyotsru Bawa. I'm the Organizing and Campaigns Director at CRC. I hope you all know who we are. In interest of time, I'll skip over introducing our organization and move to talking about this bill that you're all here to learn more about. Homes for Families is AB 1199. Our sponsor is a moderate from Los Angeles, Assemblymember Gibson. And, there are two things we're trying to address with this bill, and our presenters will go into a whole lot more detail about why this is an issue of importance. But a few things that I'll note for us as a highlight before we dive into the research. includes just this sentiment that it is really important we know who owns our communities, and that's becoming harder and harder to track with LLCs buying up homes in our neighborhoods. This trend really picked up speed after the 2008 financial crisis, but today home ownership is the lowest it's been since the 1960s, and it's really contributing to the widening wealth gap in California. Sometimes the state is referred to as a state with two very different prospects for different communities. There are certainly the haves and the have-nots. And at CRC, we're really trying to bridge that gap. And so for us, the issue of home ownership and access to home ownership is deeply central to our mission, and ergo 1199. In fact, just yesterday, I heard a statistic that home ownership, particularly for Black Americans, dropped in 2019 to become even lower than when the Fair Housing Law was enacted in 1968. Today, 40% of all rental housing is owned by corporate landlords. They are removing upwards of 300,000 single-family homes from the market. And at a time where California is really facing a housing shortage, this further complicates the housing market and the prospect of people having stability in their homes and communities for generations. The all cash buyers of single family homes are problematic for some of the reasons I mentioned, but also for tenants who are in these large corporate, in these large buildings owned by corporate landlords are also struggling. The tenants who are trying to get habitability concerns addressed don't know who the actual person is that they're dealing with. And our friends today with SAGE and the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. Welcome. They've done some essential research, or some research that is so essential to this bill. We are really grateful for the work that you're doing and the common cause that we have with you. Without this work, without your work, I really think we would not be able to move this bill forward. So thank you very, very much. I will pivot to Alex Ferrer with Strategic Actions for a Just Economy in South LA to take us off and dive into the research. Hopefully 1199 will make a whole lot more sense and you'll want to support the bill when he's done. Go ahead, Alex.
All right, thank you so much, and super glad to be talking about 1199. It's, of course, one of the recommendations we highlight in this report as to how we can kind of put a stop to all the problems that I'm about to talk about. So, hi, my name's Alex. I'm with Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, based out of South Central. And I am a researcher there, recently been working on a long-term project about corporate ownership in the rental market. So in the United States today, corporate ownership represents a growing and significant share of all rental housing. In 2018, for the first time in the major national survey, corporate landlords owned more units than individuals for the first time in history. This share has grown quite dramatically since the 2008 financial crisis. This is, at this point, been a well-documented trend, especially with kind of the consolidation of single-family homes, which experienced quite a significant jump into corporate hands. Over 70,000 single-family homes in LA County, for example, are now corporate-owned, which was a phenomenon that was more or less very marginal before all this. The origins of the kind of transformation of ownership in general, however, go back a little bit further than 2008 to the birth of the REIT, the Real Estate Investment Trust, and especially the LLC in the 1970s. These entities saw widespread adoption, especially in the 1990s when the tax code changed to make investment through one of these vehicles much more favorable to landlords. So in 1977, Wyoming created the LLC tax structure. They were the first state to produce a law that would enable this type of entity to form. And in 1988 is when the IRS ruled in favor of pass-through tax status for these types of entities, which made them very desirable for investors. By 1997, all 50 states had adopted the LLC structure as part of their tax code. This timeline is from a report, Who Profits from Crisis? Housing Grabs in the Time of Recovery, by a colleague, Joel Montano out of UCLA. It's a very excellent report that I highly recommend as well. So this is part of a kind of a suite of social transformations that are associated with corporate ownership, which is commodification. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of housing being turned from a home into a commodity, but also assetization, its transformation into an investable and interest-bearing asset, and financialization, which is the embedding of homes into global financial circuits. And so there's some key terms that we use to differentiate the types of landlords in our study. The first is an individual investor. That's somebody who just owns property under their own name as a natural individual. Historically, the majority of all property owners, especially for single-family housing, but becoming less and less so. A mom and pop landlord is a shorthand term for a small landlord, defined in Los Angeles as an entity that owns under 5 units, which is 4 rentals and 1 primary residence. An investment vehicle is any entity created to hold investments on behalf of an individual group or other entity. So this is all sorts of corporate forms, LLCs, of course, but also includes things like a trust. So a family trust or a probate trust would qualify as an investment vehicle. A corporate landlord is a subset of investment vehicles that use a specifically corporate business entity, such as an LLC or a limited liability partnership, or a corporation, an S corp, for example. We exclude trust as a matter of convention, but our report suggests that they're really not so different in many cases. An institutional investor you may hear about. This is a large investment vehicle that manages the pooled assets of high net worth individuals, corporations, other investors. This is like your Blackstones. Also can be a private equity. But private equity itself is just the consolidated wealth of individuals that's used to invest in properties and businesses and stuff. So this can apply to both hedge funds and institutional investors that make investments, but also to the family trusts of high net worth individuals. And then a Wall Street landlord is a specific term used to talk about highly securitized, kind of financialized companies like Blackstone that are publicly traded for the most part. So where are we in LA today? We're in a situation where the majority of units, 67% of units, are owned by investment vehicles. There's a specific geography to this investment that's concentrated in kind of high rent and quickly gentrifying areas. As you can see from this map, this is the downtown area. That's kind of linked up to the rapidly changing Westlake and Hollywood, East Hollywood areas by these dense kind of structures of corporate ownership. And in LA County, or in Los Angeles, more units of all kinds are owned by corporate landlords than is true nationally. And the trust plays a very large role here in particular. So as I said, 67% are owned by investment vehicles, 43% by specifically corporate entities. Over 55% of all multifamily is owned by corporate entities, which tend to own larger buildings. The average corporate owner owns 19 units or more, and the average individual investor only owns just over 1 unit. 66% of properties are owned by landlords who are larger than mom and pops, regardless of entity type, and of those, 86.5% are investment vehicles. When you combine those figures, you get that over 50% of all properties in Los Angeles are owned by, or all units in Los Angeles are owned by large investment vehicles. So as I said, this is kind of the myth of the mom and pop has been really enduring, but less than 25% of all units are now owned by small individual landlords. This is, a much smaller share than is owned by these investment vehicles and by larger landlords. So why do we care about this? First, corporate ownership is associated with higher rents. Increasing proportions of corporate ownership in a tract are associated with statistically significant higher rates of rent in those tracts. So high concentrations of corporate ownership saw 5.5% rent increase over the study period versus 4% in low concentration of corporate ownership tracts. Do they buy in neighborhoods with increasing rents, or do they drive the increase in rents themselves? This is a question that we don't know the answer to yet, but either way, there's a significant association between these two factors. More frequent evictions. Academic research has shown that institutional investors and corporate landlords file for eviction more frequently, eviction of all kind more frequently than small landlords. And we found that in LA, corporate entities are responsible for more than half of all Ellis Act filings since 2007 that we could identify the ownership for. And they filed at a rate 5 times higher than their share of properties in the county. So they only own 14% of the total properties. Again, units is 43%, but they are responsible for 53% of all Ellis filings on all properties, which is a very significant share. In our report, we take some case studies to profile the bad behavior of landlords that is resultant from specific investment strategies that are enabled by the corporate form. So drawing on Joel Montano's work again, we profile Abraham Stein, who runs what Joel calls an eviction machine. And this is a system in which over a 10-year period, only 44% of original tenants were remaining in buildings that Joel studied, and that there were over 660 eviction filings across the units that he identified with this owner in that time period. We also associate corporate ownership, particularly LLCs, with slum housing conditions. A growing body of academic research has made the same association. The privacy and liability protections of these vehicles incentivizes kind of predatory investment strategies like milking, which are extremely harmful to tenants, their health and emotional well-being, of course. We found a 30% higher complaint incidence in corporate-owned buildings that were eligible for DPH complaint inspection. So that's all buildings 5 units or more. And 10 of the 10 top violators in Los Angeles were either corporate landlords or investment vehicles like trusts. We profile some notorious cases of this. The Heffesey family trusts, for example, between 2017 and 2020 were cited for 213 violations across only 54 eligible properties, almost exclusively in South Los Angeles. They're one of the top 10 most cited entities in LA County. And Sage has been organizing against Heffesey for over a decade. In 2007, Sage had an active organizing campaign in several Heffesey buildings, and tenants were being faced who were trying to advocate for improved conditions in these buildings with threats to call Child Protective Services, physical and verbal harassment, lockouts, and similar tactics that were designed to prevent them from advocating for improved living conditions. And Sage continues to organize in Heffesey buildings today. Another case study that we use is a famous example from Los Angeles County of PAMA management, which was kind of uncovered in an investigative journalist piece. PAMA is sorry. Let me see if I can go back here. Apologies. PAMA is by far the most cited landlord in Los Angeles County, with over close to 1,000 violations over the study period of September 2017 to April 2020, and violations including bed bugs, roaches, rats, mold, and even venomous insects found within the units. They were also found negligently responsible for the death of an infant tenant in a fire in one of their properties, and they escaped responsibility due to a lack of will to pursue their case by regulators, as well as the kind of privacy protections of the LLC form, where a judge essentially concluded that it was too difficult to identify the responsible party to penalize the owner of PAMA management himself. Corporate ownership is also associated with tax evasion, money laundering, speculation, and vacancy. A lot of reporting has identified the U.S. housing market as a key site of money laundering and tax evasion. The privacy and tax beneficial status of LLCs and other corporate vehicles helps protect kind of shady and speculative investors. In our study of luxury condominiums in Los Angeles, we found that 37% were owned by investment vehicles. And that was a 45% higher value than those that were owner occupied. So these, you know, the acquisition of second homes and investment units by corporate landlords and other investment vehicles is a core strategy as well. And we, in our report, we try to draw attention to the way in which the corporate form itself has enabled these social harms. So the corporate form, with its preferential tax treatment, liability protections, and secrecy, is associated with a host of kind of social issues that flow out of corporate landlordship. The secrecy, as we've noted before, and liability protections help them escape responsibility for negligent management, for what was found to be evictions of Section 8 tenants and evictions that should not have happened, given tenant protections in Los Angeles by Joel's study, for the money laundering and tax evasion described by the New York Times, and for truly horrific habitability conditions in buildings like Hefeces. And the preferential tax treatment really makes these vehicles apt for speculation, the production of vacancy, as well as, you know, preventing value from being spent on social services and other things that may benefit tenants. So in summary, you know, there's been a lot of attention turned to corporate landlords lately, and it's for good reason. They own a growing share of U.S. units. They own, you know, a majority share of Los Angeles units, and their ownership is really associated with a host of things that nobody wishes were happening in the housing market. And so, you know, we're happy to be here calling for some sort of intervention to be made with regard to these ownership types. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So with that, I imagine that a lot of you are thinking, why is this the case and why isn't anybody doing anything about it? Well, you may already know this, but the real estate industry is one of the most powerful collective lobby in Sacramento. They spend millions and millions of dollars pushing legislation, good legislation, pushing legislation that serves them. They invest in elections, and so legislators are sometimes even less likely to actually regulate them. So 1199, what it would do is work with the Secretary of State's office. You might know that Secretary of State is where LLCs go to make filings, and they're familiar with this entity. So what we're asking is the Secretary of State's office create a publicly accessible database of LLCs and their beneficiary owners. So in the case that Alex highlighted, where a tenant died in a fire and the courts decided, well, actually it's too hard to figure out who the real culprit here is, who the real owner is, we want that to never be the case. And this is a publicly accessible database, which means tenants' rights organizations and will have access to who the owners are, but also government officials who are trying to figure out and really pin down, who the largest owners of property in their district are. That's key information that will now, be accessible to folks for informed decision-making and policy-making. With that, I will pivot to equally important information that the anti-eviction mapping project has for us. And we'll take some questions from you after Erin and her team's presentation. Please do use the Q&A feature and don't forget your questions. Go ahead, Erin.
Great. Yeah, I'm Erin. I'm with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. And I'm here with two other members of the project, Azad and Alex, who are going to speak after me. But I'm just thrilled that we got to speak after Alex, the other Alex Farah's presentation, because I think he really set the groundwork really perfectly for what we're trying to do in our project. I'm going to do the awkward thing of sharing my screen right now. Okay. So let's see. For context, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is a data visualization and digital storytelling collective that we formed in the San Francisco Bay Area in 2013. We now have chapters in Los Angeles and New York as well. We do a lot of different work. Some of it involves figuring out who these LLC evictors are, and we're going to focus on that in this presentation today. But just to note, we also do a lot of oral history and narrative work as well. But when we formed in 2013, we formed precisely because as housing organizers in the Bay Area, we were aware that a lot of tenants were suddenly getting these eviction notices from these very obtuse sounding LLCs. And we'd begun to try to map evictions because we wanted to figure out exactly who the evictors were. And we knew that, as an example, I was part of a direct action collective called Eviction Free San Francisco, and people started coming in all the time, these evictions from shell companies like Pineapple Boy LLC or 55 Dolores Street LLC. And often they would say, you know, I had this landlord for a really long time who sold the building to this corporation, and within a year or so, I got an eviction notice. So we wanted to figure out who the owners were of these LLCs so we could bring tenants together and organize multi-building campaigns more effectively and put pressure on these serial evictors using these different LLCs to evict tenants. But that was a lot harder than we thought. We were able to begin to map evictions. We were able to get owner names of Ellis Act evictions from the San Francisco Rent Board, which led us to be able to produce visualizations like this. This is a visualization of Urban Green Investments, which was a really kind of big investment company on the scene in San Francisco in 2013-14. They're not as big anymore. But with the data we got from the San Francisco Rent Board, the Ellis Act eviction data at least, we were able to start looking at, you can see these kind of darker purple LLCs here are buildings in San Francisco that were evicted by, you know, 943 Jackson Street LLC or 500 Page Street LLC. And we started trying to follow the money. We've found that Urban Green Investments was a subsidiary of a bigger company based in Colorado called Cornerstone Holdings that had direct ties to many members of the Republican Party and the Aspen Institute and also First Republic Bank. But we were doing a lot of this work by hand. This particular visualization, I think, took a couple of weeks, but we were trying our hardest to provide this data to help people on the ground organize their campaigns. We also were able to study Ellis Act eviction data and found that, in particular, these LLCs were using the Ellis Act. We found that about 80% of Ellis Act evictions filed between 2011 and 2014, I believe, in San Francisco, were filed within the first 5 years of property ownership, which shows again that, in particular, the Ellis Act is a technology of flipping buildings in cities like San Francisco, often with these LLCs that will then, after evicting rent-controlled tenants, sell buildings as tenancy in commons, which are basically condos in the making. But at any rate, we also began producing web pages like this, where we would figure out who the human was behind these various LLCs. This guy, William Rossetti, through a whole long list of shell companies that you can see on the right. It goes on and on, filed over 4,000 eviction notices in Alameda County, mostly in Oakland, from 2008 onwards. But none of them actually, using his name all through these sort of strange sounding LLCs. But what we've been wanting to do in the mapping project is create a tool that tenants can use themselves to look up a landlord, or look up an address and understand what the eviction network is. And so this is, you're getting a sneak preview of our tool Evictor book, which isn't public yet, but will be soon. We have a version that we've been developing in collaboration with different member orgs of the San Francisco Anti-Displacement Coalition, and getting their feedback on. They all have access to it right now, but we're going to be doing a public launch sooner than later. But as you can see, you can look up an address, landlord, or neighborhood, and then see pages like this. So this is, if you were to look up this address, you would see that it is part of an ownership network. And all of these different buildings you see are part of the same ownership network. It turns out that this is the Veritas network, and for folks in San Francisco or the Bay Area, you probably know Veritas is the biggest landlord in San Francisco right now, and is behind many different evictions and different forms of harassment. And the Veritas Tenant Association has been organizing different buildings that you can see here in order to fight against evictions and harassment. So this tool, the idea is that you can use it to figure out the other buildings and the different LLCs behind them. So these are just some of Veritas's LLCs, and you can see how many evictions each one has filed. And in this tool, you can also start to make connections between the main investment company and the different LLCs and see how they're connected, and then who the sort of main people are and entities are. But what we didn't really realize in making the tool was that it provided a way that we could also do a lot of data analysis to better understand the ownership landscape in San Francisco. So I'm going to pivot to Azad now, who's going to share some of our findings, and then Alex will go next. Azad, are you here? Oh, yeah.
Yes, hi. Okay. Do you want to? So just to introduce the tool, so someone in the chat asked, but most of these layers are shell companies. We have the problem of finding the true owners, and this is what the tool that we've been working on is like meant to address. We essentially take the Secretary of State registered business entity. So this is data that is publicly available. It's actually, it costs $400 to get a copy of it. We look at the partners and then the registered mailing addresses and essentially create a network out of these business entities. And so we link the interlocking business partners and executives within the different LLCs and different shell companies that they make to create a network out of these. So in this graph, we have a business entity A, and it shares two partners who also are in business entity B. And using that, we'll say that this is an interlocking network, and we will label it as such. And then the trouble is that if you are too greedy, it can blow up very quickly. If you don't try to make enough connections. So it requires both like a computer version and then also looking at very specific actors and being like, does this match what's going on the ground? So we work hand in hand with housing organizers to be like, does this reflect your knowledge of the owner that you know? And then at the same time, we do provide extra information to people who are looking at an LLC who have no idea who the name is behind them or what the larger structure or network is. Next slide. So just as an example of the way that this can go, this can get complicated. We are basically sticking to very simple graph tools, like there's machine learning and other things that go on top of it. With more data, you can do more. But as a simple example, so we have a property A, and it's owned by LLC1. So this is just in the assessor's database, and it has a registered mailing address. And then, next slide. So we can say that this property is directly owned by LLC1. And then that's a relationship that we define. Next slide. So then there could be a second property that is a property Z, and then there is another LLC that that just like that we haven't linked to that original property in the first one based on the business partner. So they've done a careful job of using a different lawyer or using a different registering address for the LLCs themselves, so they're not like visibly structured. But for the property, they made a mistake and they used the same owner mailing address. So now we have a second like approach of a link, and we kind of call this, next slide. So then we call this an indirect ownership, and then this will expand the network of owners and indirect owners. So in this way, we've done like a couple different steps of connecting LLCs and connecting possible owners. On top of that, we've also like connected the historical record of evictions of these entities, both individuals and actors. Next slide. So essentially, we've done an analysis of the data that we've kind of created with this tool in this database. Now it's good to hear from Alex about how they view trusts, because we've actually don't include trusts as corporate entities. They do, but when you look at the data, they do like resemble corporate entities, both in their kind of ownership patterns and in their eviction patterns as well. So like the distribution of evictions is much closer to the LLCs than it is to single owners, or like mom and pop owners. So just so this isn't super confusing, we show that once you like go from like this direct ownership to like expand to indirect ownership, you essentially double the number of networks that you find connected, and you scale up the number of parcels and also scale up the number of evictions. The other major thing that we find with just like linking the evictions is that the evictions are a strategy by certain actors and certain owners. If an owner has done one eviction, they are very, very likely to have done multiple evictions, and those evictions also comprise the majority of evictions done in like the total data set. I think we've linked something like 95% of historical evictions, like 5% are based because of the process we use. We haven't linked, so those could skew some one way or another, but essentially those evictors do a giant amount of the total evictions. Can we go to the next slide to kind of show? So this is just the distribution of the LLC and property owner. So essentially the biggest owners are the biggest evictors. There's one down here that apparently doesn't have very many links. We haven't figured that one out, but this is like the who's who of evictors that we've matched and we've known about. So we've created we've done manual research before we created this tool, and then essentially these networks do match what we've known and what organizers have known on the ground in San Francisco about who's doing evictions. Next slide. And just for an example, I threw the trusts on. So these we consider individual owners, but they're the biggest evictors and these are again 10 owners that own 10 plus properties, and they are the biggest evictors and also the largest owners of properties of individual owners. So maybe they should just be lumped in as with trusts, but they don't operate because they are different tax entities, so they don't really like function with shell companies in the same way, as far as we know, but we might have to do more research about this. Next slide. Now, we also looked at medium and smaller holders, so like properties that were 2 to 9, that we said like 2 to 9 properties. We filtered it by the direct and indirect ownership. It's just a curiosity of the data. When you go from indirect or when you look at like direct ownership to indirect ownership, it pushes a bunch of properties from that 2 to 9 into the 10 plus. So the number of evictions go down because the bigger properties do more evictions. So that's why like you go from 779 evictions to 771 evictions. But essentially you do see the same kind of pattern of like evictions and entities scaling. And it's like the corporate owners do more evictions per, we want to do a little bit more, have more like highlighted talking points. But what you really do see when you look at the next slide. We can skip this one. This is just the single properties. Next one. What you really do see is that, oh no, I'm sorry, I'm missing one slide. Is that you do see different financial models where these middle owners, they rack up a ton of evictions, but they only hold 1 or 2 properties at a time. So they might have 50 evictions in their history, but currently they only have a few properties. So they have a little bit of a different financial model. They're operating with different operating margins and different amounts of money, and then they function a little bit differently in the way that they operate. So it's there is a little bit of nuance about how some of these bad evictors do operate. Some of them are very big and they do a lot of evictions. Others do serial evictions over long periods of time. So so this is a map of essentially like where business entities are investing versus individual owners, and the trusts are part of those individual owners. You can see that there's a ton of business entities investing in Chinatown, in the Tenderloin, in Russian Hill, whereas we call the individual owners are kind of more spread out. Some of the bigger parcels are bigger buildings. So those are bigger buildings that these owners hold for a longer period of time. Next slide. Oh. Were there 2 maps? I think we might be missing some. But essentially, like where you see evictions are, you see evictions happening in the areas where the business entities are operating. So yeah, it's not here. So that was kind of a point that we were making. The evictions really do follow the business entity actors. So and I think the last slide, Alex is going to talk about the lending patterns with some of the worst actors. We made some case studies about them.
Thanks, Azad. I can conclude our presentation by talking about some of the case studies that we've done, taking a deeper dive into some of the top evictor networks in San Francisco. We looked at 6 of them. In terms of how many parcels they own across the city, as well as the evictions that we can tie to that particular network. You'll also note that there are a large number of legal entities in each one of these networks. They can be several hundred large, usually tied to single properties or sometimes small collections of properties. And there is a wide time range between when these are first set up and they continue to be established as these networks change their investment strategies. So we also looked at some of the top lenders that are lending to these networks. And this is using publicly accessible data from the San Francisco Recorder and Assessors database by looking at who is noted on deeds of trust and various mortgage documents between different lenders and the legal entities in each network. And one kind of trend that you'll notice is that the top lenders to each network really are supplying a lot of business to that particular network, that these networks rely on the same financial institutions to provide the capital for the work that they're doing. These lists go on quite a bit. There's a lot of information here, but we wanted to share just a little bit of these high-level summary findings with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. Let me see how I take off the spotlight from you, close my windows. I wonder, if there are questions at this time that we can dive into, and we can open up the Q&A. If my colleagues Brian and Patty will maybe read out the questions and get that conversation going, that'd be great. And to give you all a minute to just queue those up. I wanted to just highlight the second and bring into the conversation the second part, the second key component of this bill. So LLC transparency is one component, but we also know that taxes and taxing people certainly dictates behavior and alters behavior, motivates behavior. So what we're, as part of 1199, asking is that the California government charge or impose an excise tax on all LLCs that have 10 properties or more, 10 single family homes or more, or if they have a mix of buildings, larger buildings, 25 or more. So you see the tax is not supposed to be, it's not intended, and it will not be a burden for small mom and pop landlords, but for investors who are hoarding small single family homes. We really want to provide a disincentive towards that. So we're starting with 10 as a lower number to 25, which is, you know, certainly an LLC or an investment firm that's holding 25 properties. Oops, is not a small mom and pop landlord by any means. Yeah, that was my timer that AEMP's presentation is done. So I hope I didn't muddle those details too badly. If there are questions, I'm happy to take them. The details of exactly how we'll, you know, implement the tax, we're still sorting through. This bill is headed towards the Revenue and Tax Committee next. April 14th is the date. I hope you've signed on and are part of the, you know, are getting e-blast related to this. We'll certainly keep you posted when the dates come forward and share information about how you can log into the hearing related to this bill. And I'll stop there so we can address some questions while we still have our researchers with us.
We have a question from Mitch. Many evictions are done informally and never go to court. Anecdotally, I've heard it's a majority. Do you have any sense of how many evictions are done formally versus informally, or a way to capture the information? And are the frequency of informal eviction different for corporate landlords versus individual and small landlords? Anyone would like to answer? One of the researchers?
I can just say really quickly, yeah, absolutely. Like, unfortunately, it's super hard for us to capture informal evictions because we're getting official city data, and that's what's been feeding most of our research. But of course, through organizing and through different housing clinics, you know, we do see these cases all the time. And I wish I had maybe some other panelists here have some more statistics about that. But what I did want to say is that San Francisco has been collecting buyout information since 2015, and we do see that very much used by corporate evictors. I think even, yeah, almost on par with the Ellis Act. Like, we'll see it as a very, very common trend. And I think that's actually preferable to them, because then they don't have to pay the fees associated with the Ellis Act and don't have to take the rental off the market as they would if they used the Ellis Act per se. So I'll say that.
And there are tons of cases of tenants self-evicting, getting a fake notice, and you, unless they go to a tenant clinic, there's no way to know like how many of those there are. At one point before the pandemic, we were talking with some of the eviction defense groups about like organizing the data that they have to get a sense of like what that is in Los Angeles, but we haven't done that yet. So it's on one of the many things on the docket to do.
Thank you. This question goes to Alex. Do these big property owning entities use third-party property management companies, or do they generally self-manage their properties?
Thanks. I also am going to want to bring in some folks for AMP on this because I think there's something really interesting going on here. In our report, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that it's not just kind of the expansion of corporate entities into the rental market. It's not only the Blackstones that are buying properties, but it's really a corporatization of landlordship itself. So it's individuals adopting the LLC form, and other folks who might have been kind of like using their own name and assuming full liability for their properties are now doing it through all sorts of vehicles. And this is, a social transformation that has all these effects associated with the corporate landlord structure that we talked about, but it's also part of a broader transformation towards kind of increasing degrees of professionalization and integration, higher levels of capitalization, and just a massive transformation of what being a landlord is that is coming to favor larger, more well capitalized, professionalized outlets. One thing that this means is increasingly these landlords are choosing to manage the properties themselves, often through another entity that they control. We've had a lot of experience with this at Sage, but there's definitely still a mixture of this going on. But it was more common for small landlords to kind of outsource to a management company in our experience. One thing that's really interesting that I want to bring AEMP in on is that they're also coming to rely on platforms and technology in this process a lot. And that's kind of enabled by their growing kind of wealth and power. But do y'all want to take that on?
Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. I can say we have a separate project in the Mapping Project studying what we're calling landlord technology or landlord tech. And we actually recently began looking at the property management platforms being used by some of these big evictors in San Francisco. And 4 of those top 6 that we profiled are using Rent Cafe by Yardi. Yardi's been around since the 80s, but it's also, what Invitation Homes is using to manage all of its properties across the US. So there are these property management, virtual landlord, essentially platforms that have also really grown tremendously in the wake of 2008. And we're seeing even right now, there's a company called Carson in New York that is providing Veritas with what they're calling digital doorman platforms, that basically camera systems that the landlord is essentially using to surveil tenants and monitor building entrance in the name of amenitization, or in the name of making things nicer for tenants. But really what we know through experience is that these systems can be used to target tenants and lead to evictions and really fuel cycles of gentrification. Yeah.
Thank you both. Question from William. Within the bill, does the term affordable housing units refer to units regulated by a public entity, typically a lender or tax credit allocator?
It sounded like that was a bill related question. I'm not so sure. I know my colleague Kevin is on. Perhaps he would know. But since he's a participant and not a panelist, I'm not sure he can answer the question. I think
I have unmuted him.
Thank you.
So now I have to answer.
Now you have to answer, Kevin.
Well, can I buy some time? I'm going to ask to have the question restated, but I just want to say you all are awesome. You're like heroes. You are researchy, smart heroes, and I love your presentations. Even though I had heard pieces of them before, I loved it. The bill, I think for the bill, we're trying to make some distinction and say maybe we want to tax larger corporate landlords, but we make some exception if you're a landlord that owns affordable units. And so we try to define that consistent with what I think William or Bill maybe was suggesting, that as affordable housing is defined as a percentage of rent, percentage of income deed restriction relating to tax credits. So yes, and we can, folks can follow up with us for more specific questions and responses like that. But thanks for the question. And again, thanks for the great presentation.
Thanks, Kevin. Next question. With eviction moratorium in places like San Francisco and LA, how are these large companies responding right now? And do you have any predictions what they'll do with it when these expire? Is anything being proposed at the state or local level to prevent a tsunami of evictions? Any forecasting?
I mean, I can't say the forecast, but I would say that they are stockpiling money in preparation for a giant land rush or a land grab, and there have been multiple attempts like since the beginning to knock off the eviction moratoriums, both at the local level and now at the federal level. I'll post an article in a second. There's one that essentially has done it for Northern Ohio in the past day or so, and that they're trying to take that ruling national. So, I mean, I think a lot of these REITs and smaller, and this goes back to like the larger financialization, commodification of land. They see it as something that can be done from afar. They see it as an investment strategy, as something that's just a portfolio that's to be maximized without any care to community or other rights of people who've lived in homes or in cities for decades. So there's a giant pool of money waiting to flood in, and I think like both these larger actors and also people who've been waiting to purchase, like in a low finance environment, are waiting to swoop in. So there's like this vulture kind of like environment happening, but that's all I can predict.
Thanks, Azad.
Alex, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say actually that CRC, you all might want to talk a little bit about the statewide picture, but down in Los Angeles, we've been working with a group called the Cancel Rent Collective, because that is still really the #1 priority, which is to cancel rent. And part of the proposal is, some provisions to ensure the stability of small landlords through kind of direct payments in lieu of rents from the city and county. And this has been kind of a major effort, and part of it is about kind of denying these funds to these large landlords who are well capitalized and positioned to swoop in and consolidate further. So it's a real kind of needle to thread to exclude those types of actors from the aid, but also make sure that tenants are fully protected. And it's something we've been fighting for, and I'm sure the same is the case in the Bay.
I'll also plug our we have a COVID-19 like protection legislation, housing justice map. So we've worked really hard on that. It's kind of crowdsourced the data. Everything's kind of like all the organizing effort, a lot of the organizing energy, it like kind of got sucked out of pushing for stronger protections at local and state levels when the federal moratorium went in. I think it was kind of happening anyways, but that kind of, so like that is kind of a worry. The other thing is that there is this, that came to mind, there is this worry that that what they want to do is kind of have evictions happen, but at like this, like not, they want to grease the runway again, but do it in a way that there are evictions that happen in a rolling period as opposed to it happening all at once. So Gavin Newsom like put a lot of extra money into the court system in preparation for evictions. This is like, he has the power to put to strengthen eviction moratoriums, and you just have to understand. I mean, see the political and the economic go hand in hand, and he's an economic actor and a political actor who works who works with some of these actors who are waiting to come in.
Yeah. Thank you, Azan and Alex. I'm also noting some really good information in the chat, and particularly a report that Caitlin at Stage put together related to this. I'm also compelled to mention that there's actually a national report that's coming out next week. Some data has been compiled about regarding 20 of the largest corporate real estate investors, corporate landlords. It seems they have amassed $223 billion for cash in hand, essentially for, as Caitlin pointed out, a quote, since they've been waiting for this moment to do land grabs, to pick up all the properties that they can, they are at the ready. In fact, Invitation Homes, sort of a child entity to Blackstone, you might remember from 2008 crisis, they have spent $200 million already just in the 10 weeks of this year. So land grab is happening. It is already happening. I think the 1199 will give us some really important information and help us to make the case for stopping this more effectively. And for those of you who may be, considering becoming more involved with statewide efforts, I would really ask that you do so and do so now. I think it is a really interesting time at the moment where the governor's office is not really listening to advocates. The legislature had some really good bills to protect some of the most vulnerable residents, Californians, last year, and those bills didn't quite make it. And in the background, there was a lot of negotiation happening, a lot of pressure from the governor's office. So I think from everything from social media, targeting the governor and targeting also your own legislators to push them to champion whatever you see as a good bill, including 1199, I hope, but also other legislation out there. If you see it and you support it, we need you to chime in and weigh in and pressure your legislators to actually weigh in and do the right thing. And that is so key and important at this time. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I'm off my soapbox. Any other questions, Patty?
Yeah, there's two more.
Great.
From Bruce, for all panelists, nonprofit affordable housing providers are being advised to use the LLC structure for each property or all properties for the benefit of the corporate shield between properties and primary organization itself. How will the amendments proposed here affect them when they also exceed 10 properties?
So the affordable housing providers are exempt from the tax aspect of this bill. The excise tax does not apply to those who are providing necessary and essential housing for vulnerable communities, but they're not exempt from the transparency aspect. So I think if you're an LLC, but happen to be an affordable housing investor or holder, you would still be registering yourself with the Secretary of State's office, such that that information is also publicly accessible and known, both for good policymaking and for tenants information, tenant justice issues.
Great, thank you, Jasroop. Last question from William. Regarding AB 1199, what expenditures of the Homes for Families Fund will be decided annually by the legislature through the budget process?
I'm sorry, I got distracted with the chat for a second. Unless somebody else wants to take that, or really repeat the question for me, Patty.
It's about AB 1199. Would expenditures out of the Housing for Families Fund be decided annually by the legislator through the budget process?
That's a really good question. So the Homes for Families legislation 1199 creates a fund, the Homes for Families Fund, and the fund, there's intent language in there for how the funds ought to be used. But from what I understand about the legislative process, as this bill moves forward, there will have to be actually accompanying legislation that would solidify the use of this fund, such that the money doesn't just go to general fund dollars, which get allocated anywhere and everywhere, but that all the money that would be created, that would be generated through this excise tax, would only go and be applied for the purposes as indicated in the bill. So as we move forward, we'll have to clean that up as well.
That's the last of our questions.
Great. So I'm noting, thank you, Brian, is putting some helpful information in there, including some news generated by this bill already. There is a press conference next week, April, I believe is Wednesday, April 17th. We'll have the national report that we talked about. We'll certainly blast it. So if you do not subscribe to CRC newsletter and emails, please do so. I'm also going to chat a link for you to endorse the bill. It's a simple Google form. We thus far have 125 organizations that have signed on and endorsed the bill. You know, what that really means for us is that at this time, when we are talking to somewhat, you know, moderate legislators in the Assembly about the need for this bill and why they should support this bill, showing broad support for this bill really indicates to legislators that this is an issue that does impact a lot of people, and a lot of people see the need for it. There is a tax included in this bill, so I will remind you that the Assembly, 2/3 of the Assembly has to support this bill for it to move forward and really become legislation. So we need all the support we can get. So please do sign on. We will ask that you also submit letters in support as we go through committees. As I mentioned earlier, this bill is slated for the Revenue and Tax Committee review first. I believe the date is April 14th. After that, it will go to the Housing and Community Development Committee, which is a much smaller committee that we don't know the dates for that yet. And once it makes it through the Housing Committee, it will then go for a floor vote. So it has a few hurdles to cross, and we need your support. Please do sign on and tell us stories as you know them, participate. Unless there are any other burning questions or comments from our panelists, we'll wrap up. Any other comments, statements? Patty, Brian, anything else?
Hold on, there's one more question.
Okay.
Oh. What are the next steps for developing bill language?
That is a good question. As we've been asking organizations to endorse the bill and sign on, the 125 organizations, there's also a question we've been asking that clearly solicits input, which is that, would you like to be part of this campaign to move this bill forward into becoming the law of the land? And if you indicated yes, we will be pulling together coalition calls, weekly coalition calls, to really keep folks updated on what is happening with the bill and what we're grappling with when it comes to actual language and the details. So we would love your support and your input in making sure that there are no unintended consequences to this bill. And so please do endorse, sign on, join us, and be part of the coalition that works on that. Great. With that, I will express gratitude for the researchers here, for the anti-eviction mapping project team, Aaron, Azad, Alex. Thank you so much for all your hard work and for your time today in presenting your work. Alex Ferrer and Caitlin, the SAGE team. Also, so glad that your report came out when it did, and for your willingness to actually come and talk to us. Thank you for your time. Thanks, everybody. We'll send you a recording and some resources in a thank you note after this. Have a good one.